Welcome, friends, to the maiden episode of the Mona Charen Show. I am so delighted that you joined us, and I'm particularly thrilled that for our first guest, we welcomed Pamela Paul. She is now a New York Times columnist. For many years, she was the book editor at the New York Times Book Review. I first encountered her because she wrote a book called Pornified about 20 years ago that was horrifying to read, but I'm glad I did because it gave me a sense of what we're up against and what's out there. But on this podcast, we dealt with less horrifying matters. We talked about motherhood and womanhood because Pamela wrote a great column. It was titled "A Message to Girls About Womanhood," in which she stressed the things that get short shrift in our time. You know, we hear a lot about the obstacles in front of women and girls. We hear a lot about sexism and discrimination and Me Too problems, and those are all very real. But it's also the case that there's never been a better time to be a woman in America, and that there are certain aspects of femininity and motherhood and womanhood that are very positive. She even calls some of them superpowers. So we got into that and dwelled a little bit on the joys of being a woman. I hope you'll enjoy that part of our conversation. We also talked about men and about labeling masculinity as toxic, the struggles that men and boys are experiencing in our society, as well as certain female vulnerabilities that are exploited by social media. And that ties in with the high levels of anxiety and depression that we're seeing among teenage girls in particular. I hope you enjoy this conversation, and I hope you'll join us next week for another in-depth conversation. Welcome to the Mona Charen podcast. I am Mona Charen, syndicated columnist and policy editor at the Bulwark, and I am delighted to welcome as my first guest, Pamela Paul, New York Times opinion columnist and author, longtime editor of the New York Times Book Review. Pamela, thank you so much for being here.
I'm so happy to be here. Happy to be the inaugural guest.
Yes. All right. It's a great honor. And all right. I have been a fan of your writing for some time. But I was particularly arrested by a piece you wrote a few weeks ago that was titled "A Message for Girls About Womanhood." And I thought, I am so glad that someone has written this. So the very first sentence that you begin the piece with is being a woman really that awful? And, you know, there's so much messaging to girls these days that femininity is a burden, that being a woman is extremely onerous. And it's funny because it comes at a moment in our history when women are rocking. I mean, women are doing so well. If there's any group in society that's actually suffering right now from a little bit of a recession, it's boys and men.
Yeah.
So tell me about the piece, and let's talk about your sense of the way girls perceive their own femininity. You have a daughter. Talk about the impetus for the column.
Sure. Yeah, I have a daughter. I also have two sons, so I worry about both. But, you know, parents worry about their kids no matter what.
Right.
But it does strike me, and it has become clear over time, the last couple of decades, really, that there is this weird effort to constrict what we mean by girlhood and what we mean by boyhood. And there are problems in the way we do it for each. And I'll focus on girls so that we could have an entire conversation about boys. I think with girls, you know, they're often told, this is the right way to be a girl. With boys, they're told like there's no right way to be a boy. So, you know, there are problems with both. But it struck me back when I was writing my third book, which was called Parenting Inc., and this was in the aughts, that there was this sense of a division of the sexes that was divided like very narrowly according to stereotypes. So when, it used to be that the Gap just had like kids' clothes, right? And then you found that Baby Gap would have like a boys section and they would have a girls section. And there were these antiquated stereotypical looks for either sex. And I thought, well, it's smart on their part because they double their business, right? You can't just have hand-me-downs go from one kid to the next if they're very clearly gendered. But it was such a difference from the way that I grew up, which was, in granted, a liberal enclave of New York, where, it was very much the free to be you and me era, in which both, kids of both sexes were told, like, you can be anything you want. And I wore the same god awful, ugly, like red and mustard and, brown striped turtlenecks and corduroys that my brothers did and wore their hand me downs. I grew up with 7 brothers. And there just wasn't this sense that I was somehow incredibly expected to be something very different. Like the idea that girls all wore dresses had sort of been booted out with the feminist movement of the early 70s, which is, around the time I was born. So that really distressed me, combined with the fact that now that there's this sort of whole curriculum around what we call gender, that it's sort of traveling those same stereotypes, right? That like there is a certain way to be a girl, that certain behaviors are girlish, that if you don't like dolls or you don't like pink or purple or stickers or whatever it is, then maybe you're not really a girl. And I just thought, why are we going back to these very restrictive gender stereotypes that we sort of fought so hard to dismantle? And at the same time that we are emphasizing these gender stereotypes, we're somehow acting like, in terms of our biological sex, in terms of our bodies, which, as far as I'm concerned, is the only really important difference, that there is no difference between boys and girls. So it struck me that we really have it very backwards.
Okay, so here's an area where I agree with almost everything except for that last bit. You say you think that when it comes to biology, that's the only important difference. I'm not sure I agree with you there. I think there are deep psychological differences between the sexes, brain differences that are found across cultures, and so that I think those things are universal and innate. But there's a tremendous resistance to that these days.
Well, I don't think we disagree as much as you think, because I think of those things as biological, right? Some of the things that we tend to think of, those are biological in origin. We know that our brains function somewhat differently as women than those of men. And anyone who, it's not to say that there aren't outliers on both sides, right?
Of course.
But anyone who has raised children of both sexes, like, it's undeniable. You cannot delete those fundamental biological differences, even though there is a wide amount of variation.
Right. So one of the things that I think where I feel that this feminist movement missed the boat a little bit was in sort of buying into the male chauvinist view that if something was male, it was the norm. Yeah. And if something was female, it was not. So, and in fact, femininity and females are actually the majority, and our traits, are not less than if they are different from men's.
Right.
And unfortunately, so I pulled this quote from a piece that I did a few years ago where I was writing about, in defense of pregnancy. Yeah. Because there was so much in the press about how awful pregnancy is, about how damaging it is to women, and on and on. And obviously it can be. Yeah. In some instances, women endure terrible things, even death from pregnancy. But most of the time, it's actually pretty great. Yeah. In my opinion. But let me quote from this Kate Manning. She's a novelist. So she wrote, about experiencing urine leakage since she gave birth, and that she writes, "We who oppose the annihilation of our bodily autonomy ought to plaster state houses with photos of our episiotomy incisions, our cesarean scars, our intravenous line hematomas, our bloody postnatal sanitary pads and blood-stained bed sheets, our cracked nipples and infected breasts." Now, wow. I mean, so that was one of the reasons. I mean, there's a lot of that out there. And so I was so glad when you wrote about the joys of being able to give birth and to be pregnant.
Yeah.
Nobody talks about that.
Yeah, I mean, again, like not to take away from Kate Manning's experience, and those things do happen. But I think that we do girls and women a real disfavor by not talking about the positive stuff. And I think that, part of that is it's on us, it's on women, because we tend to, we feel bad if we talk about something that makes us happy when other people are suffering. Again, getting back to what you were talking about, our innate differences, like we are very relationship oriented. We do tend to be attuned to other people's feelings. And so we tend to de-emphasize the positive sides. But I really think that, this message that we're sending to young people is really counterproductive. I quote this speech, this rallying cry by the character that America Ferrera plays in the movie Barbie, which was, went viral. It was widely hailed. And it talked about, how there are all these expectations of women. And it ended with, it's literally impossible to be a woman. And I just don't think that it is. And I thought back to when I was growing up. Again, I had a total of 7 brothers, 5 stepbrothers, 2 brothers, very Brady Bunch kind of situation. And when people found out that I grew up with 7 brothers, they would say, "Wow, like it must have been great to be a girl. You must have felt so lucky. They must have protected you." And I was like, "Are you kidding? Like, absolutely not. Like I was beat up. I just wanted to be on the same, playing field as them. And at a certain age, obviously, it became clear that I couldn't compete. Nonetheless, I have never felt like it was impossible to be a woman, frankly, and in part because of all of those biological differences and innate, characteristics that you talk about. I feel sorry for men. I hate to say it. Like I feel so lucky to be able to have given birth, to be able to nourish my children. To me, those are like the most intensely profound human experiences one can have. And I feel frankly terrible for men that they don't ever get to experience those kind of extremes, but great extremes of human experience. And even childbirth, I'm not trying to be Pollyannish about this. I could tell my own Kate Manning story. I had a very tough first labor, and, which resulted in an emergency C-section. And I was given a drug and I had an adverse reaction, and I mean, all kinds of complications. Nonetheless, after giving birth to 3 children, I thought, wow, knowing that I wasn't going to have any more kids, I really felt a loss and an absence. Like I don't want to do that again. And as difficult as it was, and I was not some kind of, nature birth mama with a doula in a bathtub. I was like fully drugged, in a hospital. And it was, there were not like, flowers in the air or anything. It was very medicalized and really tough for me. And I turned out to be, relatively speaking, a big wimp. But as painful, really excruciating as that was, I wouldn't have given it up for the world. And I felt like it really, when you pass that time, when you are giving birth to children, when you pass that time, when you're feeding your own children, like just being able to breastfeed is such an really like miraculous physical process. You feel that absence, like that's not going to happen for me again. So
there's an intensity of joy and pleasure
Yeah.
that comes from giving birth and nursing one's own babies
Yes.
that people should know about
Yeah.
and
And
women
we
should know about.
And we reduce the entire conversation to this very either clinical, like these are the benefits to your baby's brain of
Right,
breastfeeding and
right,
blah, blah, blah.
right. I know.
Or, these are the onerous aspects of being, of nursing. And we shouldn't judge people who can't because it's not easy for everyone, especially
Right,
if
right,
you're
right,
on your feet working a 9 to 5 job or whatever it
right.
might be. And that is all true. And yet, why can we not also talk about the fact that it's an amazing experience, that it's so fulfilling and so gratifying for the mother as well
It's a
as for the child?
I remember I had a dear friend from college who had a baby before I did, and then I remember when I finally, because we had some issues with infertility, and when I was finally able to give birth, she didn't say anything until then because she didn't. Again, being
Didn't
a
want to make
woman,
you
she
feel
didn't
bad.
want to make me feel
Yeah.
bad. But when it happened, she said it's a real high, unlike any other, isn't it? And I said absolutely.
Yeah.
But and by the way, I intended to be not brave and to get as many drugs as possible to get through childbirth. But they made a mistake, and the epidural shot that was supposed to go, the little line that's supposed to go into your back, it was going into the mattress.
Oh, no.
So I actually went through pretty much of a natural childbirth with my first kid before they realized at the very end, whoops, because I kept saying, it's not working. I'm not
Yeah.
feeling anything. Anyway. But so lots of women feel the way we do, and yet it doesn't get out there. And instead a different message is getting to girls. And I think this is perhaps what we're seeing in terms of the number of young women these days who are saying they don't want children at
Yeah.
all. And it is growing.
Yeah.
And, if it's because they themselves had poor parenting and don't feel like they want to be mothers, I'd be the last person in the world to say, well, you should do it anyway because it's really fun,
Yeah.
because people know if they're not cut out for it.
Yes.
On the other hand, there are a tremendous number now who are saying, for really, I think, very poor reasons, that they don't want to have children. Like they feel like they can't afford it, because even people who are, well off feel like they can't afford it because they have to have, I think you talked about this, the, 4-figure stroller and all of that, all the accoutrement. Which of course are not necessary. But there's another thing that you see where people talk about not wanting to bring children into the world because of climate change or because they think that that human beings are doomed.
Yeah.
Talk about that if you would.
Well, it's interesting. I wrote an op-ed years ago before I was at the New York Times for the Washington Post. And I wrote about having 3 children as being seen as a luxury item. And when I was sort of on the fence about whether, I wasn't really on the fence. I really did always want a big kind of all of a kind family. But I was contemplating at that time having my 3rd child, and I didn't anticipate that I would get the biggest blowback from the sort of Malthusians, thought it was like overpopulating the earth, and that I was bringing about global, destruction by having too many children. And then, of course, then there were many evangelical Christians who came out on the other side and said, like, have as many children as you want to bring forth. But I think that ultimately having a family is an individual decision. And, we can't, to make every decision for yourself and your family based on political considerations. Again, I think that it's overblowing the impact that each of us necessarily has on the world. There, for everyone who is concerned about climate change, and I am concerned about climate change, the truth is, unfortunately, that it's a much bigger problem than one that's going to be resolved by whether you have one child or two children or no children. It's going to require a lot more action than that. So I don't think that is really a persuasive reason not to have a child. There are plenty of good reasons not to have children, but there are also many good reasons, to have them. It's sort of like saying you don't want to have a child during the next Trump administration. If you're opposed to the Trump administration, as I am, that's only 4 years, and after that the world will carry on, hopefully. And whether or not you chose to have a child during your time of fertility or opportunity is really is bigger than that.
100%. Let's talk a little bit more about something you mentioned earlier about sex stereotypes, because that is such an interesting flip. So I'm a little older than you, but when I was growing up, I can remember I was in middle school when the rule changed about girls having to wear skirts. Suddenly girls were allowed to wear pants, and the female teachers were allowed to wear pants. And we all thought this was a great step forward. And then I watched as these stereotypes started to creep back in. And I found it particularly notable when it comes to kids who think they may be trans, because they think, well, if I'm a girl and I like to climb trees and play with trucks, maybe I'm not a real girl.
Yeah.
Similarly, if a boy is a little effeminate and he does like to play with dolls or whatever, maybe I'm trans. Instead of, there's a huge spectrum of normal behavior for both sexes.
Yes, exactly. I mean, gender nonconformity is natural and it's good, and it's up to anyone to embrace gender nonconformity or gender conformity if that's what they want to do.
Right.
There are girls, there are parents I know, very strong feminist women who have girls who just love princesses. Peggy Bernstein wrote a book about, this sort of Cinderella, the fact that her daughter loved it when she was little. This is, it's out of our hands often. Your child is who they are going to be. And I think that it is a mistake to pathologize natural gender nonconformity. We should be saying you can be any kind of boy that you want to be, whether you like classical music and you love reading and you hate sports and you don't want to climb a tree and you're gay
100%.
or you're straight, whatever you might be, you're still a boy. And
right.
That's fine. It goes back to, again, that free to be you and me. It's all right to cry, it is fine for boys and good for boys to be able to express their emotions and to express themselves through their dress or their behavior in any way they want to be. And they are still boys. And the same is true for girls. So I think that the gender curriculum that was, established often by trans rights activists around this idea of gender identity really is gender stereotypes kind of repackaged in a way under an supposedly progressive umbrella, when in fact it's really quite reactionary to think that there's a feminine way to express one's gender. There is a feminine way to express one's identity. The number of kids with gender dysphoria, it's real. There are some kids who are uncomfortable with their body, uncomfortable in their sex. They go through periods in which they are uncomfortable with their sex. Often for, same-sex attracted children, there's a natural period in which, I think we all have recognized this from our own, school days. Even, when I went to school, no one was out of the closet, but you knew some kids were gay, often because the boys had lots of girlfriends and the girls who were gay had lots of male friends. And there's a natural period when you're same-sex attracted before you go through puberty and through sort of sexual maturation in which you just identify with the opposite sex. And that is natural and very common. And then it's also common for girls who are straight, for example, and for boys who are straight to go through periods in which they have, feelings of discomfort with their body. I mean, we know, for example, that girls often have a lot of discomfort with puberty, with developing breasts, with getting periods. Like a lot of this is not fun necessarily. And
that is one huge difference actually between the sexes right there. I mean, puberty does not have a downside for boys as far as I know, right? Well, maybe a little bit of embarrassment about getting erections.
Yes.
But I mean, other than that, it's pretty pleasant. I mean, their voices deepen and they get stronger and suddenly taller, and it's all, and they're suddenly, they can't stop thinking about sex. Well, none of that is really terrible. But for girls, it is a different story.
Yeah.
It's not so pleasant.
No, I know. I mean, there's a reason why people read their Judy Blume. And, Hadley Freeman, who is a columnist for The Times, used to be with The Guardian, wrote a really great book that came out last year about her own experience with anorexia, in which she talks about, we know this, that eating disorders, cutting disorders, all kinds of body dysmorphia are related often to a fear of womanhood, to a fear of sexuality. There's a huge number of kids who go through periods of gender dysphoria or body dysphoria in general who have experienced some kind of childhood sexual abuse or molestation. Like there's a reason why they feel uncomfortable with their sexual development and want to forestall it in some way. And unfortunately, this whole idea of gender dysphoria as, being perhaps a sign that you are in the wrong body is a solution, or seen as a solution for kids who are going through, all kinds of difficulties with their body or psychologically that really don't signify that they are in some way, need to transition to the opposite sex.
Yeah. So let's talk a little bit about hormones. Since we're talking about puberty, I love what you wrote. You said, our bodies are treated like hardships that will inevitably betray us. Female hormones are viewed as a liability, a source of inconstancy and reactivity, whereas male hormones are seen as a source of stamina and strength, even though it's equally true that the sexual impulses and poorly channeled aggression stimulated by testosterone wreak their own havoc. So you and I both, I think, Carol Hooven, formerly of Harvard, wrote a really great book called T, all about, she studied testosterone. She was literally camped out in the jungles collecting the urine of monkeys in the morning when they would pee from the tree so that she could check their testosterone levels. In any event, she wrote this whole book about testosterone, and she got terrible blowback, which is just a sign of our hysterical era that people cannot write about a basic thing like a male hormone without being, treated as doing wrong thing. But in fact, testosterone has a huge effect on both sexes. Women have it too, but in much tinier quantities than men. It does have great qualities to it. It does make men more risk-taking, more adventurous, more willing to be protective. Mm-hmm. All those are good things. It also has some real downsides.
Yes.
There is, I believe that there is a tendency in our culture, and this, again, I do think feminism has to take its share of lumps on this, portraying masculinity, testosterone, traditional masculinity as inherently toxic.
Yeah, I mean, I'm loath to criticize feminism or the women's movement because I think that, by and large, it did so much good. And when I think of the women's movement, I think of it mostly in terms of the first wave and the third wave. So the first wave, obviously, being the suffragettes and the, effort to gain political voice and equality in this country, and the women's movement, again, of the 60s and 70s, and all of the vast strides that movement made. And any social movement, of course, has its extremes. So it's not to say that everything they did was perfect, and that there obviously were also differences of opinions. I think later waves of feminism have been a little bit more mixed, but again, with some important gains and strides. So I don't want to fault the women's movement, but I do really strongly dislike the phrase toxic masculinity. I never want to use that phrase unless it's in scare quotes. So I'll just make them here. Because I just think it's really, again, it's terrible to pathologize normal behavior, and the idea that masculinity is any more toxic than femininity. You embrace those roles in a given culture to whatever extent you like or feel, able to do. Obviously, there are cultures around the world, and I'm really talking about America here, but there are cultures around the world where those strictures of gender roles are much more restricted, and that's a whole different conversation. But I do think that here, we do have relative freedom. But I think, again, it is important to think about the hormones in a more nuanced way. So all those good things you said about male hormones, again, there's a negative side, which is aggression and also obviously sexual impulses, which can be great, but also not great. I think that that's the part of, puberty that's often really difficult and embarrassing for a lot of boys. And, again, like it's, I think a lot of, there are a lot of men who feel very beholden to their sexual urges. And then on the flip side, for women, in addition to those negative stereotypes around what hormones do, there are all of these positive things that, again, among women I know, and among, I wish this message were relayed better to young women. Hormones feel like a kind of superpower. Again, like you can use phrases like empathy or intuition, or just, feeling attuned to other people's feelings, a certain kind of sensitivity and awareness, whatever you want to call it. A lot of that is, the influence of hormones on our brains that make us as women tend to think in ways that are different from men. And, again, honestly, it doesn't do us any favors to deny this, because a lot of these things are what make women more, potentially more effective and powerful in the workplace, in a workplace that emphasizes collaboration and teamwork. These are things that women are often, somewhat naturally inclined to excel at. So, I do think that we talk about hormones in this like weirdly judgmental, simplistic way that, it does no good for either sex.
Yeah. And it could well be that one of the reasons, the fact that we are seeing women thriving in our society now and men falling behind a bit, there are many, many causes for that.
Yes.
But one of them may well be that we are in a sort of post-industrial era now, an information economy. And in this economy, the skills that are called for happen to be the ones that women tend to excel at, like cooperation and empathy and the helping professions, which are huge now.
Yes. And also, organizational, like executive function.
Executive functioning, absolutely.
Are related to those things. Again, like if you've ever known a teenage boy, you will know that is just generally not, it's something that males have a harder time often. Again,
I have to say, I was not a great female when it came to executive functioning myself. I mean, I used to see my girlfriends with their, color-coded notebooks, think, what? But, so I wasn't one of those, but I do love to tell the story about I also had, I had 3 boys, and, one of them, when he was in high school, his teacher aware of these sex differences with his students, knew who was dating whom, and said to my son then girlfriend, would you kindly tell him that the assignment is due on Tuesday? That is a natural thing. It's true. Boys are, and I'm going to be talking with Richard Reeves next week, but boys actually, not only are they a little bit less organized anyway, but they develop slightly slower than girls. So that's another factor here. Well, winter is here. And if you're like me, you are dealing with dry skin, dry, cracked skin, lips that get chapped. This is all part of what winter brings. But One Skin is really helpful. Only One Skin has an OS01 peptide, the first ingredient to target cellular senescence, the root cause of aging responsible for lines, wrinkles, and crepey skin. It is also luxuriously smooth on your skin at this time of year. With One Skin's groundbreaking approach, you're not just helping your skin look and feel younger and healthier, you're also helping it to behave better at the cellular level. So you'll see improvements now and as you use it in the future. Remember, it's small habits that add up to big changes. So whether you're looking for a scientifically proven cleanser, moisturizer, sunscreen, or a whole new routine, make 2025 the year you invest in habits that keep your skin healthier and help you look your best. Use code MONA for an exclusive 15% off at oneskin.co. This company was founded by an all-woman team of skin longevity scientists. One Skin is redefining the aging process with their proprietary peptide, the first ingredient proven to help skin look, feel, and behave like its younger self. Get 15% off with code MONA at oneskin.co. That's 15% off oneskin.co with code MONA. After you purchase, they'll ask you where you heard about them. Please support our show and tell them that we sent you. Invest in the health and longevity of your skin with One Skin. Your future self will thank you. I'd like to talk a little bit also about how the two genders, I don't like to say genders,
I don't like
the two sexes, two sexes can get along and thrive together, because I firmly believe that it is very, for most people who are not gay, it's not possible for one sex to thrive at the expense of the other. We have to rise or fall together. We are mothers and fathers, brothers and sisters, wives, husbands, etc. And if women are doing well, but their husbands aren't, that's not good, etc. If their sons aren't doing well, and yet, we're seeing that. We're seeing a lot of signs of this breakdown in relations. So, for one thing, women now are less inclined to have children than men. And part of that is because they are afraid that the whole burden will fall on them.
Yeah.
So what do you think about that?
Well, look, I mean, we may part ways on this. I'm very French in my politics. I think that, the way that Europe handles parenthood and motherhood is a lot more civilized than the way we do here. I think that we do need to have more structural support for women. I think that, leave for fathers is great too. But the truth is, again, getting back to those sexual differences, if you are breastfeeding a child, if you are recovering from a C-section or from a difficult labor, it takes time to recover, and it takes time to feed a baby. And it's really hard to do that when you are supposed to be back in the workforce, 6 or 10 weeks after giving birth. So I do think that we need to have better support systems for women in particular, but for both sexes, for parents.
Can I interrupt you right there and drill down on this a little bit?
Yeah.
So I agree that it is very difficult to take care of a small child and also earn a living. And I believe that Europe does have, generous benefits for new parents. But Europe also has more stable marriages. They don't
They do.
always call them marriages. They don't always formally have a piece of paper, but they stay together with the person that they had the child with.
Yeah.
And that is more important, in my opinion, than the generous social packages, although I'm for those. I mean,
Yeah.
I think we should support young families, but I do think there's nothing more important than having a partner.
Yeah, I think, we know all the data shows, and it doesn't really matter so much what the sex is of either parent, but kids do thrive much more in a two-parent
Two
household.
parents.
So I agree with you there. And I think, going back to what you were saying about, men and versus women, and we have to get along, I think that there is this tendency to think of this as a zero-sum game, that if you talk
Yeah.
about the challenges that boys have, you're somehow giving short shrift to girls and vice versa. And the truth is, like, things are hard for both sexes in different ways right now.
Yeah.
And I don't think that paying attention to one is needs to be seen as at the detriment to the other. I think we need to be talking about both, and we need to recognize that it's not the same situation for both. So I think that that's really important. If you say boys are struggling at school, that does not mean that girls don't struggle. It doesn't mean that girls aren't suffering from incredible amounts of anxiety. There are equally important challenges for both, for each sex, and they don't negate the other one. And I don't like thinking about the sexes in these adversarial terms, like it's men versus women. I just have always found that so incredibly silly, and it comes out in every conversation that we have. Like, one of the things that really irritated me during Me Too, which I think, again, this is something that had a lot of positive impact. So I don't want to denigrate or fail to recognize the achievements of that movement, but there were aspects of it that really grated on me. One was believe women, which I found to be
Yeah.
fundamentally insulting to women, because women lie just as well as men, and women are just as manipulative and just as deceptive. And just like every man is going to go up there and say, I didn't do it, I'm innocent, I didn't rape this woman, I didn't sexually harass, women are also going to make unfounded accusations. And the other thing is that,
By the way, can I interrupt real quick?
yeah,
People stopped saying believe all women when Tara Reid came forward and said that Joe Biden had sexually harassed her. Do you remember that?
yes, yes. Yeah. I mean, like again, like we shouldn't believe anyone based on face value. You're innocent until proven guilty, and you have to look at the evidence and you have to look at the facts. And then the other aspect of it, again, it doesn't make sense to think about this as, men versus women, because women have brothers, husbands, fathers, sons who could also be unjustly accused, who could also end up on the wrong side of things. And I have no parents, mothers of sons, who are terrified that their sons will get into some kind of trouble. And basically, tell their sons, like, whatever you do, do not mess around with a woman who's had more than one drink, because you will not be believed and you will be guilty until proven innocent. And so women are just as much, there's just as much concern among women about the complexities of these situations as there are among men. This is not, a battle between the sexes. This is something that everyone should be concerned about approaching in a thoughtful and, a thoughtful way and with due process.
Yes, as I'm sure you would agree, because it is certainly the case that women don't, most of the time, when a woman says that she has been sexually assaulted or abused, she's not lying.
Right.
Okay. Most of the time, she's telling the truth. Most of the time, there's a huge downside for her to lie. But some women do lie. And the notion that you should believe all women is taking it too far.
Right. And the flip side of that is most men are going to lie and say that they didn't do it.
Right.
But some of them are telling the truth.
Right.
That they didn't do it. So
right.
again, like it's just, I think that we we go towards black and white thinking when it comes to thinking about the sexes.
Yeah. Um, it is also the case, and I don't know where you stand on this, but the number of people in America, and certainly in the developed Western world, probably it's more broadly true too. Although, as I mentioned a second ago, people in Europe behave differently. But the number of people who think it's important to be married in order to raise children well has plunged to incredibly low numbers, even among conservatives. Fewer than half say that it's important to be married if you're going to raise a child. On the other hand, it's interesting. Even though people say they don't think it's important that you be married in order to be a good parent, they say they personally want to be married.
Yeah.
So I wonder if do they not want to be judgmental, or do they really not think it matters?
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting. You can find a poll there's so many contradictions within polls. And I used to, a couple of decades ago, write a monthly column about public opinion polling and the way in which questions are phrased. And we know how much that, you can sway answers one way or the other. And the fact is that people often say what they wish they believed on public opinion surveys.
Sure.
Doesn't reflect what they actually think of in their own lives. And I think, that contradiction there points to that. I think that people don't want to be judgmental. I think that, this is like, remember when Murphy Brown was like such a big deal, going into single motherhood deliberately. No one wants to act disdainful of individual people, women's decisions around parenthood. But I do think that, especially if you look at the evidence, we know, even if just from a fundamentally economic point of view, kids do better when they're in a 2-income household than they do when they are in a single income household. And if you talk to single mothers or single fathers, I don't happen to know as many single fathers, so I don't.
There aren't as many.
There aren't as many, but it's hard. And, just to say that it's possible and that it's great and it's wonderful. Yes, that's all true. It's good. But it's also, it does no one any favors to deny the reality that it's also really tough. It's so hard not to have backup. Women I know who've done it on their own, they have to build their own infrastructure. They often have to lean on their own parents or extended family for help. And, they need to be well-resourced financially to be able to do it. There's just no denying that it's a lot harder. And when you talk to single mothers, they worry, especially if they have sons, but also if they have daughters, because both sexes, benefit from having both sexes in their families. They worry about not having a male role model. They worry about their sons. They wonder if they should get a male babysitter. They recognize the fact that if there aren't, if they aren't in a 2-parent household, that something is lost.
And of course, there's a class element to this as well, which is that it tends to be college educated people, the upper 30 or 40% of the population who are getting married in numbers very similar to what they did in the 1950s and raising children in intact families. And it's the less educated, middle and bottom of the population that is trying to raise kids, in single parent homes. And that makes it all the more difficult. And it just continues that bifurcation, because those kids raised in, under-resourced and stressed single parent families have so much less of an opportunity to rise in the world. Yeah. And so this cycle is perpetuated.
Yeah. I mean, I think this is typical. It's a typical luxury belief, right? It's very easy for someone who is college educated, upper middle class, in a, secure relationship or marriage, and says that it's fine to be in a single parent household. It's a lot different if you don't have all of those resources and forms of security to say that it's the same. It's just not.
Yeah. I want to ask you about something else that comes up a lot when you're looking at social science. And this is the so-called happiness gap
Hmm.
between parents and non-parents.
Yeah.
And you see this a lot. Every time I see it, I stumble over it because I just don't believe it's true. So, yeah. So let me just outline what it is.
Yeah.
So, there have been surveys that have found that, people who are childless are happier than people who have children. And, it's been, more than one study. Of course, you have to be skeptical of studies in general. A lot of them aren't replicable. We know about
Hmm.
the replication crisis, et cetera. But anyway, it is out there and a lot of people keep repeating it. And maybe some of the people who are hearing this are, young people who are thinking about becoming parents and
Yeah.
wondering whether it's guaranteeing that they'll be less happy. What do you
Well,
think about these studies?
yeah, I mean, happiness studies are tricky because there's a difference between happiness and life satisfaction.
Hmm.
I think people have done a lot of really smart work on explaining the differences between the two. There was a great book that my friend and amazing journalist Jennifer Senior wrote, All Joy and No Fun, about that sort of looking into that, the fact that on a day-to-day basis, right, parents are more
Hmm.
stressed out, they're tired, they have more worries, they might, be more anxious and suffer from more frustrations. But overall, very few of them regret having children. And I think, it's also a question about when you ask this question in someone's life. So the answers are going to differ over the course of your own lifespan and your children's, right? There are periods in which having a child is notoriously more difficult when you have very young children who are highly demanding, when you have teenagers who are notoriously difficult. But I think that when you ask that question of people who have raised children, who are now adults, and they have the company of their adult children, their answers are often, that they would never see their lives otherwise. And of course, we always hear about, the sort of deathbed question, do you wish you'd worked more, made more money, or would you have rather have had more time with your children or loved ones? And it really does come down to those human relationships, and the fact that many people as they get old are very happy to have had children to be there with them and to share their lives with and to carry on their own, their family and their traditions. So I think that um we have to be a little bit skeptical of the idea that people are necessarily happier just because they don't have children. Like, I have 3 kids. You have 3 kids. Are there moments where you're like, wow, if I didn't have kids, I could have done X, Y, and Z. I could have like flown off to Tahiti. I wouldn't have had to pay for, 3 college educations or whatever it might be.
All that orthodonture.
Yeah. Would it have been easier? Yes. Would it have been more fun? Maybe sometimes, but would it have been as fulfilling? Would you have had those same, incredible highs and feelings of deep satisfaction? I'm sure the answer differs for everyone, but I think that overall, I think you have to get back to that difference between life satisfaction and fulfillment, and differentiate that from the kind of everyday moment of like, did you have a good day, or do you feel happy today, or do you feel worried or anxious?
Yeah, there's a tremendous confusion in people's minds, I think, between pleasure and happiness.
Yeah.
And, being a parent is not always pleasurable. On many days, it's downright miserable. But
Yeah.
but in terms of meaning in your life and deeper happiness, deeper life satisfaction, as you put it, it's so key. I mean, not to say you can't be happy without being
Yeah.
a parent, but for people who want family life, it is the most rewarding thing there is, in my
Yeah.
opinion.
Well,
And
I also think like again, we think about this word happy, and when you ask parents, for example, like what do you want for your children, we're all supposed to say I would like my kids to be happy, right?
Right.
We also recognize that that it's not as simple as that, right? Because no one can be happy all the time, and you can't protect your children from unhappiness.
Right.
Ultimately, I think what most parents mean is that they would like their children to lead a satisfying, meaningful, and rewarding life that's filled with joy. And that I think is really different from, simple happiness.
Right. And there's another just small little detail, but I always think about this. Like when you go out with your friends and you get together, you may talk about all kinds of things. Music, the latest show you've seen, what's going on in public life. But almost always, if you're out with friends, you will get around to how are your kids doing? Everybody is interested in that. Everybody's kind of obsessed, honestly, with their own kids and how they're doing. And, so it's just, if it were not a source of deep, deep meaning and delight in life, you wouldn't see that. So anyway, all right. I do also just want to ask you a little bit about you're so insightful on issues of of happiness and of the social stresses that girls are under in particular. And so I wonder if you can talk for a bit about the studies that we've seen and the research. It's gotten a little bit better since the end of COVID, but the numbers of girls who are having mental health crises now is off the charts.
Yeah.
So, what do you make of that? And how much of this do you think is real and what can we do about it?
Well, I mean, mental health issues are a huge problem among both boys and girls. But yes, it's more notable among girls. And again, I think that goes back to why I wrote that piece, that I think that we are creating this idea that being a girl is somehow a hardship and that womanhood is something to fear and stress over because it's just this sort of endless state of oppression and you're almost like in a defensive crouch against the war on womanhood, and I think that's not a helpful way to think about it, and I also think that again the messages that we're sending through these sort of gender curriculum is that girlhood has to look or be a certain way, and I think that's exacerbated by social media. I mean, again, going back to this
Talk about social media. Yeah, that's a huge part of this.
Yeah, and going back to those fundamental differences between girls and boys, if you think about the fact that girls are so attuned to other people, they're so empathetic, they're so sensitive, right? Those are great things, but they're also potentially extremely they make us very vulnerable in the sense that we are really subjected to what other people think of us. Our sense of self depends greatly on other people's opinions, and to be constantly subjected to judgment, to having your value quantified in likes and upvotes and follows and hearts and group texts and all of that through social media, it's basically like girls are put through the ringer all day, every day. So if you think about like when you were growing up, Mona, or when I was growing up, like the worst moment in the day, like for me, during like let's say some of my worst periods of middle school or elementary school would be like going into the cafeteria, looking around, seeing some girls sitting together talking and being like, oh, I can't go over there, those girls are too cool, or that group's too pretty, or that person said something mean about me, and a note that I glimpsed over someone's shoulder. You have these kind of like paranoid feelings and inklings of bad things that were being said or happening, or everyone's watching you. But the truth is, most people weren't watching you, right? You just felt self-conscious, and eventually you'd make your way over to some group or sit by yourself and someone would join you and it would be over. But that moment of fear and paranoia that everyone is looking at you, judging you, etc., is constant with today's girls because they are looking at you and judging you on social media. And it's not just paranoia, it's real. It's real. Like girls go to college and to high school today, and if they are not in certain WhatsApp groups, if they are not in certain Snapchats, if someone has blocked them, they know it. It's very concrete and it's constant. So you feel like every moment of potential insecurity is it's expanded exponentially from what we experienced when we were growing up, and it doesn't end, right? So there was also the fact that at the end of the school day, you could go home and then you were kind of done, right? Like maybe someone would call or wouldn't call on the phone, and that would make you feel good or bad or whatever.
Yeah.
But you didn't have a sense that like there was an entire party going on without you for the rest of the day, which it is on social media, and that you had to participate in it because either, if you weren't there, then you were missing out on something, or something, something could potentially happen or be said about you, or someone will notice that you weren't in that chat. And then it happens after you go to sleep. So it's almost like you can't, if you say like, I'm going to go to sleep and put my phone away, you're getting notifications, or you just know that people are on there because other kids are staying up late. So it's just this constant sense of being judged and of seeing girls who in your face who are prettier, more popular, doing more glamorous things, have more money, or lead more exciting lives, have talents you don't have, getting into colleges that you aren't getting into, winning competitions, looking better in a bathing suit. I just think like that kind of incessant social pressure is hugely negative for anyone growing up today.
It is like a diabolical machine
Yeah.
to hurt girls' feelings.
Yes.
You know?
Yeah. Yeah. And, I mean, women my age, women your age, like, we get hurt by this stuff. And we're adults.
Yeah, exactly.
And I can't count the number of times where like people our age, my age, your age, in reference to social media will be like, I feel like I'm in middle school. Like I feel like, oh my God, this reply all thing happened, or someone texted me. It's like you are returned to middle school. These girls are growing up and they never leave middle school. And they never get to graduate and leave everyone behind. It's turn a new page.
Yeah. So I assume you look kindly upon efforts to ban cell phones in schools.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Yeah. There is no good reason to have phones in schools. The only good reason is to be liked as an administrator or to appease parents who like the convenience. And the truth is the grownups in the room need to stand up, take a stand. This is not valuable to education. It is not valuable to kids' social lives or to their mental health. And there is zero reason, not even school safety, because the data on that show that it does not help if there's, heaven forbid, something like a school shooting happens. There is no reason whatsoever to have phones in schools at all, not in class, not in lunch at all. Have them in the locker, locked up. And it's going to take a certain amount of courage and, courage to be disliked, courage to, do the unpopular thing. And it is endlessly frustrating and disappointing that leadership in our schools isn't taking a stronger stand.
Yeah, you wrote a pretty blistering column saying that the problem was the parents.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah.
The parents, they want the convenience. Like, don't forget to walk the dog when you get home or whatever it is, right?
Yeah. Look, it is convenient. I'm a parent.
Yeah.
I did not allow my kids to have cell phones until high school, and I suffered. I mean, they suffered, but so did I, because my kids biked or walked to school. And yes, it's really disconcerting if they don't come home when they said they would. And I worry as much as anyone else and think like, oh my God, they're like lying in the street, bleeding
in a ditch.
profusely. The big bad wolf has come. But it's too bad. Our parents got by without it. Parents today can get by without it too. And to say that the world has changed is true, but not all change is good. And sometimes you have to stand up in the face of negative change.
This is the one thing. It's a pretty bleak moment with the, Trump returning to the White House and a lot of very baleful things going on. But I do think this tendency that we're seeing in a number of states to ban cell phones during school hours, at least,
Yeah.
is the first sort of healthy sort of response, kind of an antibody to a virus in our society that I've seen in a long time. Do you agree?
I do. Yeah.
Yeah.
It's nice to see that it's a little bit less of a partisan issue. And I
Yeah.
think that, again, people are so afraid of what everyone else is going to think. They're going to think, oh, you're a Luddite, you're afraid of technology, you're afraid of the future, blah, blah, blah. You want to inhibit free speech. And it's just nonsense. Like these are
Yeah.
all straw man arguments. Think about the risks, think about the costs, think about the benefits, look at the evidence, and then do the right thing.
Yeah. 100%. And I think many parents would be wise to do what you did and not to let their kids have smartphones at all until, what was it, 16?
15 is in
15.
high school.
Okay.
Yeah, I wish I could
Yeah.
say it was 16, but
Yeah.
I'm not that
No,
strong.
that was brave of you. All right. Well, Pamela, this has been a great opportunity to chat with you. Thank you so much.
Oh, I hope to do it again. Thanks so
All
much for
right.
having me.
Okay. Pleasure.